Good evening. It has truly been a beautiful day on the campus of the University of South Carolina. Our provost was supposed to be here to greet you all this evening, and he called me I was talking with some faculty about tenure and promotion at noon today. He gave me a call and he said, I have to be a father this afternoon. He has 2 children. One took ill yesterday and one took ill today, and he had to go get his daughter from a camp in North Carolina. So he sends his greetings and his regrets, and he hopes that maybe next year he can be here to welcome. Now I have the great pleasure of welcoming all of you to the 10th Annual Fall Festival of Authors. And you can see on our screen here that this is the first of 3 events. There will be one on Thursday, October 15th, and it will be Billy Collins, who is a former poet laureate of the United States. And that will be in the Business School auditorium. And then on Tuesday, October 20th, our own Kwame Dawes will be here in this room again at 6 p.m. So we do hope that you will come again. It is really a great honor for all of us to be here. It is such an exciting event to hear from world-renowned authors and to basically get stimulated intellectually and I would say even spiritually. It is my humble pleasure to thank the anonymous donor who has given us the opportunity to have this Fall Festival of Authors. With the budget cuts last year and the budget cuts this year, and who knows what's going to happen later in the fall or spring, so many things have had to be cut. So many things we have not been able to do. And it is a wonderful thing that we can have this fall festival. So we thank from the bottom of our hearts our donor and want her to know how much we appreciate it. Tonight we have with us an author who has been all around the world. I was talking to her a moment ago saying, well, if you really want to come to South Carolina and stay, we'd love to have you, but you might want to have a mountain home in the summer. And then I realized that she's been in so many places in the world that are so hot that that was a foolish statement on my part. But I would like to, at this point, turn the podium over to Elise Blackwell, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Christine. And I'd like to ask everyone to take a moment and fill out one of these orange cards before you leave. It will help the Thomas Cooper Library plan future fall festivals. One of fiction's greatest gifts to us is that in its seeking of truth about our human condition, it encourages and even requires both the reader and the writer to imagine in detail what it might be like to live another life. A form of role-taking that can foster our capacity to encounter other people with imagination, with openness, and with empathy, and so just possibly improve the world. In her life and in her books, Masha Hamilton embodies this desire to understand others and make a better world. In her first career as an international correspondent, Masha brought to American and other readers the lives of many others around the globe, covering the Intifada and the partial Israel withdrawal from Lebanon, Kremlin politics, and the life of average Russians under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, the daily lives of street kids in Nairobi, the experiences of drought and famine victims in isolated northeastern Kenya, and the realities for women in Taliban-dominated areas of Afghanistan. Masha has not only reported on these lives, but often actively worked to make them better, including through 2 world literacy projects that she founded: the ongoing Camel Book Drive, which supplies books and other support to a dromedary-born library in rural Kenya, and the Afghan Women Writers Project, which connects U.S. women writers and teachers with young Afghan women developing their literary voices so the world might hear their stories. But of course, Masha is here for us tonight because of her fiction. She is the author of 4 highly acclaimed novels: Staircase of a Thousand Steps, The Distance Between Us, The Camel Bookmobile, and, fresh out and already in a second printing, 31 Hours. Her novels have been book sense picks, selected by Barnes & Noble's Great New Writers, and named to Library Journal's Best of the Year list. Her new book, 31 Hours, has been chosen as an Indie Next pick by independent booksellers around the country and described by Publishers Weekly as gorgeous and complex. It is one of the most powerful, beautifully written, and exquisitely braided novels I have ever read. A novel intelligent about both people and words. To quote another reader, "You don't just read this gut-wrenching book, you become part of it in a deep, primal way." It is through fiction, even more than through her brilliant reporting, that Masha really plants readers to walk for a while in another's shoes, whether that other is an 11-year-old Jordanian girl with a gift for prophecy or a tough Western journalist grieving her lover's murder, a naive librarian or an outcast Kenyan boy whose life is changed by reading, a homeless man who applies business principles to panhandling, or a young and privileged New Yorker plotting an act that should be but is not unthinkable. Please join me in welcoming Masha Hamilton, fresh in from Brooklyn, to South Carolina.
Thank you, Elise, for that very generous introduction. I almost wish we could just kind of stop here. And thank you very much for letting me be part of this program. I am really honored and thrilled to be here. I am loving Columbia. I've been walking around the campus and the area and soaking in the good weather that we're not going to have in New York until many months pass, and the beautiful campus. And I'm really had the pleasure of talking to some master's students earlier today, and I'm so thrilled and impressed to be here. I'm happy. I'm going to read a little bit and focus on 31 Hours, and afterwards, then I'm happy to answer questions about anything else, including the Afghan Women's Writing Project, which is the newest thing I've been working on, literacy project I've been working on. 31 Hours is, well, it's really dear to my heart. Probably the last novel that you write is always dear to your heart. But for me, it really was an exploration of a lot of very personal issues and things that were concerning me. In a way, part of it really came to me from being living in New York during difficult times. I sort of went nuts when we got ready to invade Iraq. And I have 3 kids going to school, 2 of them going to school in Manhattan at that time, 1 going to school in Brooklyn. And I began to get nervous about what would happen if they couldn't make it back to me in Brooklyn. My oldest was kind of going like, oh, where are you during the day, and compiled the list of where in Manhattan or Brooklyn or any of the other boroughs the parents were, along with work numbers and connections. Some of that fear, that paranoia that would kind of sweep through me at various times informs this novel. But in a way, it's also just about being young and wanting to change the world, which is what being young is about, I think. And it's also about being the parent of someone young, and about missed connections, and in certain ways about love and the yearning for love. It's told in multi-character viewpoints, and I'm going to read a few little excerpts from some of the different characters, if you'll allow me. I'm loving working in multiple character viewpoints. This is the second novel that does that. That many viewpoints. Camel also did that, the Camel Bookmobile. And it just allows me to explore a lot of different voices. And for me as a writer, it's really fun to sit down and on that day sort of channel the voice of this particular character. It really broadens the experience for me. I think I'm going to start by reading a little section from the panhandler, Sonny Hurt, who is one of my favorite characters in the book. He is inspired by an actual panhandler that I have encountered very often on the F train, who says Sonny's line, which is something like, if you ain't got it, I understand because I ain't got it, but if you can spare a quarter, a dime, a nickel, something like this is kind of Sonny's line as well. And this is a little section from Sonny that has to do a little bit about love, I think, and missed connections. The train pulled in, and Sonny, the police officer, and the TSA employee all got on, each choosing a different car. Sonny's car held only one other person, a black transvestite with a bouffant wig. As the train began to move, he, looking very much like a she, rose and sauntered past Sonny, hips swaying almost as if he were a model on a catwalk. He wore a long coat, which he kept open in the front to reveal a silky red dress that couldn't be keeping him warm. He was well padded. His curves looked authentic. He had nice eyes, too, Sonny saw. Only the black, high-laced tennis shoes seemed misplaced. He stopped about 3 feet away from Sonny, took hold of a high handrail, and flexed his shoulders. 2 stops later, he turned around and headed Sonny's way again, studying him carefully. A couple got on and moved to the far end of the car. The transvestite slid into a seat opposite Sonny, staring openly now. Sonny sat easy, a non-committal expression on his face, knowing it was best to wait it out, let the fellow finish whatever strutting was needed. The transvestite leaned forward and said, in the most feminine voice Sonny could imagine, "You de best thing I seen in a while." Sonny chuckled. "Then that ain't no good for you." "Name's Murray," the man-woman said. "You looking for some warmth? Some help passing this winter night?" "Don't be thinking so," Sonny said. "Won't even charge you much for it. Maybe a cup of coffee afterwards." There was a time, Sonny thought, time he might have said yes to this self-created, self-named person who inclined hopefully towards him. Might have said yes even though he knew that once they were alone together, a dingy padded bra would fall off to reveal a concave chest, and the legs, shaven but still a man's, would take him back some, and as for the equipment itself, it would be a long way from his dreams. He'd have said yes despite the shortcomings, because people had those days when they felt pretty self-sufficient, and then they had those days when they were as needy as a babe. Whether they slept on a bed or on a bench didn't matter. Everybody had days like that. Loneliness pulled at every part of you, and 60 seconds of adoration, even paid for, seemed the only chance you had at keeping the pieces from flying off in all directions. "Not tonight," he said to Murray. "Thank you, though." "Ooh," Murray said, "a polite refusal. You're making my blood run hot." And I'll read another section. This one, let's see, from, I guess I'll read this one from Jake. Jake is the father of Jonas, our young man who is contemplating an act of violence in the subway system. And Jake and his wife, Carol, ex-wife, are separated. Jake runs an art gallery in Manhattan. Carol has been having intuitions that something's wrong with her 21-year-old son. But when your child is that age, you're not sure if those are intuitions that you should be listening to or that's a normal part of the separation process. She's become pretty concerned, though, and she's going to give Jake a call in this little section. In the back office of his gallery, Jake's laptop was open to Craigslist. Missed connections on the subway, his favorite frivolous reading. Number 5 train to Bowling Green. You were wearing light brown boots and something green on top. I was the guy with glasses. We sort of exchanged glances through the people standing in the subway car. You were awfully cute, and I don't see many gals with your sort of style around here. Maybe lunch, maybe more? Last Friday night on the downtown F train, me, the brunette with a low-cut black dress whose chest you kept staring at. Yes, I noticed. You, light brown hair with goatee, blue shirt, and more of a chance than you gave yourself credit for. Want to see him in person? Holler back, cutie. He didn't have a goatee, but maybe he could still respond to that one. Nah, he surely hadn't sunk to that level. He pushed the laptop away and began running his finger down a row of figures on a spreadsheet when the phone rang. He reached for it immediately, pleased for another distraction from issues of money and also tantalized by the possibility that the caller might be bearing good business news. Maybe a client wanted to buy a piece from a recent show, one of the big paintings, please God, because that would take a weight off. Or maybe it was a new artist, some undiscovered talent looking for a place to hang his work. Even if it were only one of his regular artists checking on sales, that was fine. Jake would strike up a conversation that might lead somewhere productive, at least more productive than reviewing financials or even reviewing Craigslist. He glanced at the phone number casually and then held the receiver away from his ear. 212-556-1382. His number. Or rather, his old number. Or rather, Carol's number, now that Jonas didn't live there anymore, and Carol didn't call him, not ever. He put down the receiver without answering. After another minute, the phone began to ring again. Damn her. She knew he was here, somehow. He answered. Hello, Carol, he said. Jake. Her voice sounded deep and husky, and God save him if it didn't bring back a rush of memories. God save him if he couldn't suddenly imagine her 21 years old, on her back by the lake that one afternoon, her traffic-stopping legs askew. God save him if he didn't recall the precise and precious taste of her, and that tiny, pristine hotel room in the French Quarter, the time they barely saw the city, and the intoxicating night they slipped away from a fancy summer party and made love behind the cabana, and again in the shallow end of the swimming pool, and even the time right near the end when they passed one another in the hallway after another fight. It's Jonas, she said. Jonas? Jake felt sluggish, like he was being awakened from a dream. Jonas? What's happened? What's wrong? Nothing. He's fine. I mean, I think so. At least it's nothing specific, she said. It's just that oh God, Jake, something's going on, even though I'm having trouble articulating it here. He's in trouble or troubled, I don't know what, because he's been not Jonas. Carol paused, and it sounded like she took a sip of a drink. I think he's cutting classes, she said. He hasn't called me. I call, there's no answer. I went to his apartment today and he wasn't there. I haven't heard from him in more than a week. How much more than a week? It's been 9 days. Carol. Jake leaned back in his chair. 9 days? So I guess you haven't spoken to him any more recently than that. I hadn't really thought about it. No, I guess not. I wasn't particularly worried, though. This is Jonas. It isn't like him not to call one of us, usually me, granted, but at least one of us for this long. Jake tried to ignore Carol's slightly snide tone. Yes, this is Jonas, he said, but this is Jonas growing up. I mean, my God, he's 21, isn't he? Jake calculated quickly. That's right, so it's time. Jake, she said, something's wrong. I know something's wrong, and I don't know what to do. Carol, he said, what do you want me to do? I don't know. You're a guy, he's a guy. Yes, Jake drew the word out. So can't you just go find him? Call, leave a message on his machine, and maybe he'll call you back if he doesn't want to talk to me. Go to his apartment, and if he doesn't answer the door to you either, insist that the landlord let you in. The landlord will let you in if you demand it. She was completely wound up. He wanted to tell her to go to work on her pottery wheel, let the clay turn beneath her hands. How about if I put a call into his cell, he said, and maybe I'll reach him, but if not, we wait one more day. Sunday would be the day when he's home, if he's going to be home at all, she said. He has classes Monday. I think you should go over today, now. The more I think about it, the more I realize this is the right thing to do, Jake. If you take a cab, it will only take 45 minutes. The gallery's open today, he said. Can't one of your girlfriends staff it for an hour? Another comment he chose to ignore. Jake, please, she said after a minute. Hang a back and a sex sign, or I'll catch a cab and come watch the gallery if you want. He did think Carol was overreacting. No, he was sure of it. But he wasn't getting any business anyway. Plus, Jonas was their son, even though Carol had done the bulk of the raising, and she didn't ask him for much. Okay, he said, okay, okay, okay. But Carol, if he's with some young woman, then the next time he doesn't call for 9 days, you're going to just have to find a way to be more mellow about it. Agreed? A deal, she said. Oh God, let him be with a girl. Let us all, Jake thought, let us all be with a girl. And the next section is from the viewpoint of Mara, a young girl whose parents are separating. And she is home alone. She's a sibling left home alone, and she's trying to figure out how to handle that. So she's decided to go on the subway to her father's apartment in Brooklyn and hope that she can figure out a way to get her parents back together. But one of the things that I wanted to explore in this novel was spirituality, the role of traditional religion or the lack of it in our lives, and how we try to fill that gap. And this little section is when Mara wakes up in the middle of the night before she's going to go and catch that subway and try to connect with her father. It occurred to her that she needed to pray. Yet she had no idea how to do it. No one in her family ever talked about prayer. It seemed an old-fashioned ritual, something vaguely embarrassing, an act favored by grandmothers who wore plain brown fringed shawls that they'd knitted themselves. If she wanted to pray, she realized, she would have to make it up. In the corner of one shelf above her desk, she kept a small collection of little objects she'd found or been given over the years. They were piled together and forgotten. She hadn't looked at them for ages, yet they somehow still contained the aura of the sacred. Tiny talismans. She decided she would arrange them in a semicircle on the floor near her bed, and perhaps they would give her success when she spoke to her father. She wondered briefly if this were superstition instead of prayer, but she decided to recite a few words, and then surely that would make it prayer. First, she selected a feather she'd found when she'd been walking with her father in the park 3 or 4 years ago. It was remarkably colored, white with tinges of violet. She'd intended to research to find out what kind of bird shed such a feather, but she hadn't done that yet. She put the feather on the floor not far from the head of her bed and squatted down. "Please, God," she said. And then she didn't know what to say next, so she rose and went back to her shelf. Next to the feather, she put a Chinese coin with a square cutout in the center that she'd bought in Chinatown. Then she added a brass bell Vic had given her. "Help me with my mother," she said before the 3 objects. She wasn't sure that was a prayer, but it was tangible. "And my father," she added after a minute. She put 2 red candles in place next. Neither had been lit yet. She'd been saving them for a special occasion, and she realized this was that occasion. So she went out to the kitchen, past her mother's closed door to get matches, and then to the bathroom to pull off 2 little squares of toilet paper. She put the toilet paper under each candle so that if they dripped wax, it wouldn't get on the floor. And she thought it was a good sign that she'd remembered that at all. Her mind was behaving, paying attention to details, and that would be important later when she spoke to her father. As she lit the first candle, she murmured, "Sweet potato." As she lit the second, she said, "Thanksgiving." She didn't know exactly why she said these things, but it occurred to her it would soon be Thanksgiving, and she couldn't imagine that without her father living at home, so this had to be resolved before then. She continued forming the semicircle with a tiny vial of topaz stones that had been in her Christmas stocking one year. Then 2 marbles, one a jasper, white marbled with blue, and the other a bloody, a red, black, and white swirl. She placed them close together as though they were a couple. She added a pine cone and said, "Sky," and then earth. Surely sky and earth were holy words. Next to the pine cone, she placed a little wooden frog no larger than a muffin with a ridged back that made a kind of music when rubbed with a stick stored in a hole that ran through its neck. She looked at the frog a few minutes, then took it away. Something about it struck her as unlucky for a prayer, though she couldn't say precisely why. And the last little section I'm going to read is really closer to the beginning. It's the first section in the viewpoint of Jonas, our young man, 21 years old, who feels something's wrong with the way America is working, and that it's the job of the young to change it and to make people pay attention to what's wrong, and he's trying to figure out how to do that. He's got a plan, and it's the 31 hours before that plan. He'll have doubts during this period, but this is the first Jonas chapter. Tile. Cool powder blue tile, chipped in places and hard against his bare feet. And a razor with an orange handle. A package of them, actually, 10 in all. Bathroom tile and drugstore razors. Bathroom tile and drugstore razors. Bathroom tile and drugstore razors. It was a prayer. That wasn't such a preposterous idea. Anything could be a prayer. Should be, in fact, every step Jonas took, every idle thought that eased through his head, a holy, ongoing dialogue with God, or perhaps a plea, because at this moment he shouldn't be chatting with God as though they were dinner partners. He needed to be a supplicant. Please give me the brains to remember what I've been taught, and please the speed to do it quickly, and the calm so that I can avoid undue attention and accomplish what I need to accomplish. Mercy, too. Have mercy, please, O God, on my soul. Allah, for God's sake. Allah, get with the program. Unexpectedly amused by his own private stumblings over his creator's proper name or name in proper context, and pleased that he still had the capacity to be amused, Jonas smiled faintly at himself in the mirror. His skin looked even paler than usual under the fluorescent light, smoky, white and artificial, and it merged seamlessly into the ash blonde hair that stood out from his head in waves of thick curls. Ridiculous hair, really, locks that little boys have, but then outgrow, though he never did. Jonas sat on the toilet and stretched his long legs, already stripped of their jeans. He hadn't been able to sleep, had been sleeping poorly for months, in fact, so he might as well begin the process now. He twisted his torso and picked up a digital camera from the top of the toilet tank. He intended to document each step along the way so the pictures could be there for someone to look at later and maybe understand. He had an idea, loosely formed, that he would want to be understood if there was any wanting left on the other side. He hoped candid shots of him preparing might illustrate his foresight as well as his determination, because news reports would surely flatten him to a two-dimensional zealot. Jonas snapped a photograph and glanced at his wristwatch. 7 minutes to 2. In 7 more minutes it would be, he used his fingers, 31 hours until. 31. The maximum number of days in a month, the length between menstrual cycles. Al-Kabir, the all-aware, the 31st name of Allah. 31 verses in Genesis, chapter 1. The 31st verse, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. It was evening, and it was morning the 6th day. 31 hours which, given the elasticity of time, could shrink to 31 seconds or expand to 31 years. Who knew what the next 31 hours would feel like to him? And then he snapped a picture of his legs, hairy legs with knotty apple knees. Men's legs in general aren't very attractive, though they are functional, and it's more important to be useful than attractive. There it was, another prayer. More important to be useful than attractive, O Allah. Jewish dad, atheist mom, raised faithless, Jonas had, despite that, grown adept at spotting prayers. So that's all I'm going to read for now. I hope it gave you a bit of a taste, and I'm happy to answer any questions or any comments anyone wants to make. If not, I have to go sit down. So, yeah.
I'm kind of curious, as you're writing different perspectives, different characters, how do you approach the challenge making the text read as one complete story?
So when you're writing different characters, how do you make this text read as one story? Well, it's each book is different, but speaking about this one, the 31 hours was a framework that presented itself very early on in the process. So I had the idea of the countdown and what they're doing, what's happening, during that time. That made it easy in a way. So as I moved through the characters, sort of whoever was doing something pressing at that moment, it was their turn, it was their chapter, it seemed to be, and that kept the thread running through the story, if that makes sense. So in this case, that's how it worked.
The decision to make Jonas the son of a Jew and an atheist, was that considered, or was that just the way he kind of showed up in your head?
The decision to make him the son of a Jew and an atheist. He comes from the Upper West Side of New York, Manhattan. His background, he fit that from the beginning. But it also worked with the fact that I did want to explore spirituality, and I did want to explore what it means when we raise our kids outside of religious traditions, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. We try to raise them spiritually, but they're not. That happens a lot in New York City for sure. In Manhattan, the kids are raised with maybe spiritual beliefs, but outside of a tradition, and how that can sometimes raise questions and doubts and maybe create more anguish than it might otherwise. Certainly does in the case of Jonas, I would say. It contribute to lifelong sort of, maybe it would have been there anyway, a certain degree of it, but he feels he has no answers. So the best way for me to explore that issue was to have this sort of mixed relationship with the Jewish dad and the atheist mom. And it also made the way that they are apart and then they come together during this 31 hours, it worked better too for me.
Did you ever find writing from multiple points of view to hinder you in any ways?
Did I ever find writing from multiple points of view to hinder me? Not so far. The two books that I've done from many points of view, the Camel Bookmobile, and this one, I really loved it. First of all, it's really interesting for me as a writer. I mean, it's just I'm hearing the story for the first time when I'm writing it. I'm always interested in what's going to happen next, and so it's more fun for me to sit down and have this new character, different character, talk to me. I can't imagine being able to tell this story and explore all the things that I wanted to explore from the viewpoint of one character. I can't see how it would have worked, how I would have been able to explore, what it means to be an idealistic young man in this particular chaotic and often confusing world that we live in, and be idealistic, and what it means to be the mother of such a man, and I kind of wanted to explore both of those things as an example, and because the subway, in some ways this is an edgy poem to the subway, and because the subway is a mixture of people coming and going, and there's a lot of missed connections on the subway, and that's one of the themes of the book. I needed somebody like Sonny, I think. I needed his story too. The homeless panhandler who sees the subway as his church. He needed to be part of this story as well, and Jonas's girlfriend. Their voices, I think I needed to hear their voices to be able to explore all the things that were interesting to me as I was writing it.
Do you think that Jonas is like a lot of young men his age in these times? And are you worried about that? Or is it something that you want us to be aware of? Or I guess I'm just trying to understand. I haven't read the book, but just from what you've read.
I wanted Jonas to be identifiable. I didn't want him to be the other that we could easily dismiss. I didn't want him to be someone that we would say, oh, well, thank goodness nobody I know or anybody, I've ever met is like that villain. I didn't want to treat him as a villain. And I don't see him as a villain. I see him as an idealistic, confused young man who's 21 years old, and if he can make it to 31, he's going to be quite a remarkable man, you know. There were a lot of things that drove me to want to make him that identifiable. I hope I've succeeded. I've heard from some readers that they feel that they know that Jonas, or they know someone who's like Jonas, and that was certainly my goal. I don't know. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
I think so, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I went in necessarily wanting the reader to be worried about that. I mean, I think that's part of what you were asking. But I'm sure that some of it sprang from my own concerns about where we are as a country and how young people are left to interpret that. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Without being more specific than that,
Well, the concern is that he is planning, I guess, to do something terrible in the subway.
That's
to
right.
other people. And of course, I don't know what is driving him, although it sounds like it's an idealistic vision, which may not be that different from other people who come to this country to do that. I guess, my question, I guess, is more like, what can we do to help people like Jonas, to help the younger generation to have hope without going to such drastic measures? And maybe the book answers that. I don't know.
No, it doesn't, and I hope you're not asking me either, because I don't know. No. There are no answers in the book, actually, really. I mean, it just raises the questions. But I don't know. You know, I think, I mean, you know, as I say, in many ways, this is a very personal book. I have 3 kids and live in Brooklyn, New York, and, you know, have been overseas a lot, and have great desire to eliminate the idea of the other anyway. I don't like this, you know, the whole concept that when we go to war, I think historically leaders need to say there's an us and a them, otherwise how do we go to war, right? If it's all us, then it gets very confusing. So we have to say there's an us and a them, and we're fighting against them. But I think the more time you spend overseas, the more you begin to question that. And you begin to think, well, not really. Really, there's a bunch of us, and in between us, there's some of them, but it's not really like that, you know? And so maybe that's one of the things that's troubling Jonas, among other things. You know, he wants, and I also think that that when you're 21, you're supposed to want to change the world for the better, aren't you? I mean, I figured that's what we're supposed to want to do when we're 21. If you're not want to do that, we got to do something about our 21-year-olds and get them geared up again, you know, to do that. Because in a way, that's what Jonas wants. Also, he wants to, and he's confused about how. And maybe that confusion stems from partly where we are as a country historically right now. Without being more specific, I think that's all does that mean? I don't know if that answers exactly.
I'm getting a picture of you as somebody who used to ask questions as a foreign correspondent, and you're still asking questions because you're not necessarily able to answer a question, but you're asking some big questions. Can you talk about other ways that your background as a journalist is informing the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and it really does inform what I'm doing now. I think that as a journalist, I always felt very strongly like the pipe through which the story traveled. I understood that, if I was working for the LA Times or if I was doing a radio piece for NBC Mutual Radio, that nobody really cared about me. They cared about who I was interviewing and what they were going through. And as a result, I needed to... because I was in a position where I was often covering chronic violence, I needed to suppress my own emotions and horror. I couldn't stop with my own horror and freeze and make it about me at that point and not be able to report. The result was that I put often a scab around my heart as I reported. And at first I did it very consciously. I remember precisely when I did it and when I made the choice. But as time went by, as the years passed, I became less aware of it. When I stopped and began to write fiction, I remembered that scab, because in writing the very first novel, which is not about me at all, and has nothing to do with my life, still I had to tap into my own emotions to write about those characters' emotions. And so I realized, oh my gosh, look at that. Look at what I've done. Wow. And so I kind of pried it open and reconnected with those emotions. So it opened me up more to put more of myself in the work. But even though that's true, I still feel like the pipe through which the story travels. I still feel like that. And so I don't outline, and I really try to be true to these characters, and I try to get to know them very intimately, far beyond what is actually on the page, so that they can lead the story, and so that I am representing them as truthfully as possible in their complexity, in their full, beautiful, stunning complexity, and that I can have empathy for them, even if I don't always like them, and even if they're very different from me. And that is certainly what I was doing as a journalist. I mean, I was definitely trying to have empathy for whoever I was interviewing. If it was a Palestinian planning an act of violence, a Jewish settler, planning also an act of violence, a member of the government that I didn't really, whose viewpoint I might not agree with, whatever. It was my job to have empathy for them and to report their story as truthfully as possible. And I still feel like that's what I'm trying to do as a fiction writer.
When did you write poetry?
Poetry? Oh, I haven't written much poetry. I love reading it. And when I'm working on a novel, it's often the best. I find it's the best thing to read. Yeah, I see. At least I looked over to see if Elise was agreeing with that, because in some ways it's just a, you can get caught up in telling the story, and those little pesky cliches can kind of sneak their way in, and you can forget about really the importance of it, of bringing it down to eventually a paragraph and a sentence and a word level. And reading the poetry is sort of like, I think of it as like what do you have, the little sorbet to clear your palate or something like that? It's the same, to me, it's the same kind of thing, So anyway. Anything else?
I thought maybe you could read us some of it.
No, I don't have anything.
Do you look at the youthful idealism as being a necessary evil or a possibility of virtue?
Of virtue?
Yes.
A necessary evil or possibly a virtue?
Yes.
Oh, I think, I mean, not that this matters that much, but I think, it's very important to be an idealistic 21-year-old or whatever. I mean, I think as long as we can, I think there's some really great things about naivete and retaining it as long as possible, and I think the idealism is crucial. I worry about, there were times when, right before the Iraq War, when my second novel was out and I was doing touring also on college campuses, and sometimes I would be in a college campus and I remember I was on a college campus somewhere. Sometimes it felt like they weren't questioning enough. Sometimes it really upset me that they should be questioning more. I thought, wait a minute, you should be saying, wait, does this make sense? I don't think it does. You should be saying about everybody my age, what? I don't think so. Isn't that, I feel like it's the job of the 21-year-old. I don't know. Not that this matters, it's just my personal opinion, but I do. And I do remember feeling at various points concerned at some of the colleges that I didn't feel, by the questions they were asking me, because my second novel was a little bit more overtly political, and somehow or another I got into these, it wasn't meant to be, but somehow I got into these political discussions more often. And I felt that the students should definitely be saying, are you sure about everything at that point? And maybe saying, I doubt it.
Well, what pushes an idealistic young man or woman into becoming, rather than questioning and looking, into becoming a fanatic? Which some of them certainly are, in both to the far right and the far left, or Christian or Muslim.
Yeah, I think the question is really, when does healthy skepticism become a dangerous obsession? And I think it's one of the questions that the book kind of tries to ask as well. I mean, I don't know that I know the answer, except for Jonas, you know. Beyond for Jonas, I don't think I know. But I think it's you know, it's a question worth asking. Because, I mean, I have to say, you know, I really like Jonas. And I want the reader to like him also. I mean, I think that there's a lot of very admirable things in his impulses, you know. I didn't want to make him some black, horrible villain. I think, first of all, black, horrible villains are too easy to write off. Yeah. And that wouldn't be so good for us as readers. And also, I didn't see him that way. I saw him as, and I just, you know, just to give you just a little bit of a background, I'll tell you very briefly something that I mentioned in master class earlier today. When I was 14, a friend of mine was murdered, a 14-year-old friend. And this was really obviously a very shocking, you know, unbelievable event. And in our group of friends, she remained a formative part of our growing up. And we would, you know, think of her a lot when we would go to the first dances, when we would get our first kiss, all the things that she would not experience. She remained part of I'm still have friends with these, and this is a part of our formative, shocking experience. And it was so repelling to me. And then as a journalist, 8 or 9 years later, I was covering, I was asked to cover what was going to be an execution, the second execution in the United States after a ban of execution, and it was in Indiana, and it was a young man who had killed a woman in front of her children and then killed the children, raped and killed her. Horrible, right? I mean, and because of my experience as a child, I think I was even more like, oh, God, oh. And so I went to the foster family's home, and I met them for the first time in the months leading up to this, the execution. And the foster mother said to me in that first meeting, "Look at him, isn't he handsome?" And like I couldn't look at him, and I kind of like, I almost like, you know, felt almost like had to turn away. But there was nothing I could do because I'd been assigned the job of getting close to this family in the 3 months or so leading up to the execution so that I could get the story very closely. So I continued to spend time with the family and did get very close to them and finally was with them. I was the only journalist with them the night of the execution and spent time, you know, all the time leading. I spent a lot of time with the family and after the execution as well. And during the course of that time, I began to understand this killer a little bit better. And I began to understand his background, what had happened to him as a kid. His birth mother had basically sexually molested him. He had been trying several times to speak out and say, "I've got these problems," and nobody had really listened. And his foster mother recalled some wonderful things that he'd done, kind things that he'd done. None of this made me like him. None of this made me forgive him, but it made me realize the complexity of the situation. And I guess some of that complexity, this is not what 31 Hours is about, but I guess some of that complexity is what I wanted to bring to the character of Jonas, if that makes sense.
I wanted to ask you about Afghanistan, as you mentioned it. And now is this huge debate, should we send more troops or not? And you've been on the ground. What is your opinion?
Really, gosh, you guys ask hard questions. Can't I just tell you an anecdote or two about the Afghan women? I mean, okay, I think that it's very complicated because our troops have dropped bombs in the wrong places and they have squandered goodwill. And they've done it through not understanding the Afghan psychology. And when somebody has come to them and said, you know, that's the house where the Taliban live, or Al-Qaeda is going to be there tomorrow at 2 or whatever, this has been a trusted source that's given them the right information before, so they've believed it and dropped bombs. And in fact, you know, very often they're being told lies, and they're being told lies because Afghans have had to lie to survive. And so it's a very complicated cultural thing that the American troops have not fully understood. And yet, if we abandon the country and just pull out, that seems all wrong to me on several levels also. So what I'd like to do is rewind it and go back to, you know, early 2002 and just redo the whole thing from that point on, you know, get in more Dari speakers and more Pashto speakers and more people who have a cultural awareness, and just do a better job with the troops on the land. Forget Iraq and just focus on Afghanistan. I mean, in hindsight, I can tell, you know, and I was saying this at the time too. At this point, it's very difficult. So I would like to be among the group of people who gives our new administration a good bit of support and a good chance to try what they feel is best. I would like to assume that we're getting to the point where military intelligence is no longer an oxymoron, and I would like to see if we can, you know, do something that will be beyond my ability to understand, but that will be the right thing. Any more hard questions like that? I mean,
Tell us the anecdotes about the Afghan women.
much easier, much easier. Well, the first time I went to Afghanistan was in 2004, and I was able to talk to Afghan women in prison in Kabul and in Kandahar, and child brides and war widows, and I was able to talk to matriarchs of opium-growing farmers and to travel around the whole country. There were a lot of incredible stories. Every day was an amazing story. I had a trip that filled me. Each day I felt totally full, and I would have to write it that night in my little laptop. We had like very little electricity, so I'd be doing it on battery, and I would try to empty out at least enough so that the next day I could fill up some more. And at that time I felt that the situation was still very difficult for women. For example, in Kandahar, I spoke to a 12-year-old young girl in prison who was there because her father, the only surviving parent, had agreed to marry her off to a man her age for the bride price. And she supposedly had quietly objected to him, and then supposedly was flirting with an 18-year-old shopkeeper, although how in a burqa exactly you flirt, I'm not sure, but okay. And so she'd been put in prison for this. And when I got a chance to speak to the Chief Justice of Kandahar, a man with a beard below his knees, literally, who had been there since Taliban time, so it's sort of like our Supreme Court, you know, you survive the... and I specifically asked, among other things, about this 12-year-old girl, and he said to me, I'll never forget, he said, "I'm sorry to tell you, but women in our country are not able to take care of themselves physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially. But don't worry, we'll get her out of prison within the next couple months, as soon as we can. And as long as he'll still have her, we'll marry her to the man her father chose." So there was clearly a long way for women to go even then, but there was a sense that things were moving in the right direction. When I was just back in November, election day, that for a few weeks this last November, that sense was gone. I couldn't travel nearly so much. I went to the north. I couldn't go to Kandahar. When I was there was when the New York Times reporter was taken, and we all knew it, although it was not being reported. Taliban holds the south of the country. They have a ring around Kabul, and they occasionally reach in to show they can. The women told me stories then. The main stories they were talking about was how quickly it had changed for them last time. And one woman told me a story. She was at the time the Taliban took over in the 90s. She was a young mother in Kabul, and she described being out early one morning and hanging laundry out on her balcony, and a car screeched up in front, braked to a halt, and a man was glaring out at her, and it frightened her, so she went back inside. She put on a head cover. She had been out there bareheaded, put on a head cover, and he came out of the car and came up to her apartment and went up the stairs and pounded on her door. Frightened, she opened it up, and he said, "Don't ever go outside without a burqa again." And a week later, she and her family left for Pakistan. So the talk then was about how quickly things changed for women. And the fear is that sort of change, some version of it could happen again equally as quickly. So because of that, we began the Afghan Women's Writing Project. We're reaching out to Afghan women, and novelists and poets and memoirists in America are mentoring them online, and we're putting their work up on a blog, first names only for security reason, so that they can hopefully have a voice, and we can keep that voice going no matter what exactly happens in the coming months.
What is the name of the blog?
You know, the best thing is to Google Afghan Women's Writing Project, but it's something like awwproject.wordpress.com, you know what I mean? But if you Google Afghan Women's Writing Project, it will come up, and if you read any of the blogs and you want to comment positively on any of the pieces, that's an awesome way to support these women. They do read what is the responses that they get on the blog, and would be really happy for anything you want to say.
You said you don't use an outline when you're writing a story, correct? As young writers, the whole idea of producing a story seems a bit of a mystery. It seems like each writer has an own way of creating a story. Could you give us a little bit of insight into exactly how your writing process,
Sure.
how your stories come about?
So a little bit of insight into the writing process for me, at least. I will say that outlines in my classes that I teach are the most divisive. That class is always the most divisive class, because there are people who completely think that outlines are crucial, and those of us who don't outline waste a lot of time and are ridiculous and airy-fairy, and then there are the people who don't outline and say, look, this is the way to go. And so I have no, whatever works for every writer is great. I mean, I want to say that, whatever works. And there are certainly writers who feel like I need to know what that light is at the end of the tunnel. I need to have a sense of it. And all I ever say to them when they're in my class is, fine, but please try to have flexibility in case the story surprises you, so that you don't, it's like a piece of pottery. We don't want to see the potter's fingerprints on the pot. We want to see the pot, almost like God made it, right? And so the novel is the same thing. You don't want to see my fingerprints and my forcing this and that. You want to see it just created and look almost like it was always that way. And I think for that to happen, you have to have a certain amount of flexibility. For me, I just have some small sense of what is pressing against me, what I want to explore, and then usually a character starts presenting him or herself. I do think that it's best to start a novel or a story at the moment, as close as you can to the moment when everything changes, either right before, right during, or right after. Like Lord of the Flies starts right after the plane goes down. The moment when everything changes is a good moment to start, and you don't always know that until you've written a while, which is fine. And then I just try to listen to the characters. It's almost like I'm on, one of those long flights from JFK to Dubai or something, like those endless flights, and I've trapped next to somebody who just won't stop talking and keeps telling me their story, and I just keep listening, and then half of it's not really very useful for the novel, but that's okay. And they just keep, and eventually it probably is a more time-consuming way. But for me, if I were to outline it, I would be bored by it, and it would be very hard for me then to say to my family and friends, I have to go work now, I can't hang out with you. So I have to feel excited by, like, gosh, I wonder what's going to happen with this character today. Oh my God, you're kidding, that's what's happening? I mean, I need a certain amount of that to keep me going, keep me writing and keep me engaged myself. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Would you just finish, since there are so many young writers in the room, maybe just finish with talking a little bit about what you talked to our graduate students this afternoon about writing about what's important?
Yes, yeah. I did talk about what I think is something that I just have felt more and more reinforced with each novel, which is writing what you really, really care most about. What is keeping you up at night, what is scaring you, what makes you laugh so hard you can't stop crying, what worries you. I think this is the best thing that you can do. And I think it's true for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think your work is going to be stronger, it's going to be more authentic, and it's going to be more yours. That's important. But the second reason is probably even more important, because I don't have to tell you that publishing is in a turmoil. Nobody knows what's happening with the book. Some publishers are not publishing for a season, or it's getting harder and harder. So you need to have something else that you get from your work and from writing, and that's often a very personal thing. And if you're writing about what you really care about, what really moves you, then it almost becomes your spiritual engagement with life, your way of interpreting the world, interpreting yourself, understanding in a broader sense what it means to be human, your way of thinking about these kinds of topics. And the second part of that is, for me, of my advice, is don't write to expound. You know, if you have a dearly held opinion, first of all, I'm old enough to say that it's probably going to change at some point. But even if you're pretty sure it's not, that this is absolutely the truth, and you really know it's always going to be the truth, so write an op-ed piece or an essay or a blog. But don't do that in your fiction, because I think that as a reader, I hate to feel preached to, even in good fiction, and even if I'm among the believers, I don't want to be preached to. That's not what it's about for me as a reader. And I think it's not what it should be about for us as writers either. We should be engaging, I think, our readers in this discussion, engaging them in the question, saying, what do you think about? Maybe, what if, I wonder, and let it be something that we could all, that could be part of the discussion. So that's my 2-minute advice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful.